Welcome to That Girl Club. We're your hosts, Christina
and Katarina, and we're here to empower you on your journey to becoming that girl in every aspect of your life.
Join us as we dive deep into inspiring conversations with influential entrepreneurs and experts, sharing their insights and strategies to help you thrive.
From navigating the struggles of womanhood to launching your dream business and everything in between, we've got you.
So buckle up. You are about to discover what it really means to be that girl.
Welcome to the club.
Welcome back, TGC. We are so excited because today we have Tesia Bryski, the founder of Shine Mental Health Collective, and co-director Alyssa Malizia. Together, these two ladies opened the third location of Shine and are now a team of over 20 therapists. Tesia and Alyssa are both registered psychotherapists, entrepreneurs, and clinical supervisors who are dedicated to fostering mental well-being in their community. Tesia and Alyssa specialize in supporting individuals through a wide range of mental health challenges, including anxiety, depression, eating disorders, PTSD, ADHD, burnout, couples therapy, and so much more.
These two intelligent and ambitious ladies are taking over the city with their expertise in the field. Today, we talk to them about the struggles of being a woman and practical tools we can use in our everyday life to improve our overall mental health and mitigate burnout. We also dive deep into intimate relationships, the true definition of narcissism, childhood wounds, and so much more. We get into so many different topics with these two, and it truly felt like a mini therapy session in itself. You don't want to miss out on the conversation, so let's do the damn thing.
Tesia, Alyssa, welcome to That Girl Club. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having us. We're so excited to be here.
Why don't you kind of like start off by just kind of telling us like how you two became one?
Alyssa and I met, 2019, I think, working in a private practice together as therapists. And I think it was just kind of like an instant connection.
We were next door neighbors,
cute.
Room neighbors. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
The office neighbor.
Literal therapy room neighbors.
Yeah.
That's so funny.
Yeah.
And when you meet someone, you're like, oh, she's a girl's girl. Like, she gets it.
You just know she's your vibe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I was
literally
like,
us when we met. We're like, we're going to work together. And
we were like,
besties.
we're going to be besties.
Yeah. And this works perfectly. And so that's kind of how we met. We worked together for a good couple of years. And then in 2022 is when I founded the Shine Mental Health Collective. So again, her and I were working at a private practice for a while. And then I branched off. I got all my hours and settled into independent practice and opened Shine. Shortly after, Alyssa and I went to go grab, pizza? I think we went to Fratelli.
Oh, yeah.
And we were like, we should start a podcast.
Yeah.
Like, this is so fun. We wanted to collab on something.
Yeah.
And she had some ambitions around opening up her own practice. And I think it was just kind of a matter of, would you like to join?
So
it was like
what are you
timing
doing?
was just right and like stars aligned. And,
pretty much.
Oh, that's amazing. I love that.
She asked me to join her. We've since opened a location together. Tesia has other 2 locations. And the rest is history. Yeah.
I know, it was a really good pairing. I'm super type B and Alyssa is very type A. So it was kind of like the yin and the yang.
Oh, yeah.
It was everything we needed.
Yeah,
and
that
so,
works.
Yeah.
It does work. Like, she'll really be like, you don't have to panic about this. Like, this can wait. And then I'll be like, hey, we haven't addressed this for several weeks. Like, we need to do this. So we're really just balancing each other out. Yeah.
That's important
really
in
well.
any business relationship.
Yeah,
100%.
Right?
Yeah.
It's just so
100%.
funny because we always say we take turns. Like, one day I'll be panicking and the next Christina is. So
Yeah, that's so true. Like, we're both definitely
take turns.
Yeah, we're both type A, but we take turns.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's important too.
Either
But
way.
yeah, it just it clicked. We opened the third Shine location on December 3rd. Is the day that we opened our doors, and it's just been fantastic. The interest is there. We're busier than we thought we would be. We're really grateful.
Yeah, it's
really
been
grateful.
an incredible journey.
Yeah.
So we haven't even been open that long, but it feels like we've been working together for
It's
years.
true. Yeah.
I feel like that's how you know it's right too, though, right? When you have that feeling of like, oh, feels like we've been doing this forever. It's like something was meant to be there. You know?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, that's amazing. I love that. So do you feel like, because I know you said you guys are really busy, obviously the clinic's been taking off, which is obviously amazing, congrats. But do you feel like that's because there's such a surge in mental health right now? I feel like just from, you know, being in the media, all the things we see, it's talked about a lot. right?
I think in part, like, I think the need is there, and we're in a profession where the need is there. So that's sort of its own thing. But I also think there's a lot of therapists now. Like previously, like when we were in our master's degree, it wasn't, at least for me anyways, I didn't really hear a lot about like people becoming therapists. And when psychotherapy became its own profession rather than people having to do their PhD, it just started booming. So we're also really busy because of therapist interest as well. So there's like client interest and then also therapist interest, and that's kind of keeping us.
Do you think
really
with
busy.
time too, the stigma around therapy has also kind of diminished? Like more and more people are more accepting and understanding of the fact that like, hey, maybe I need this too.
Yeah, you know what? I think there's always been a need for mental health services. However, now what we're noticing, especially with the younger generations, with the advent of social media, the access to all this information, like everybody knows how important it is to take care of your mental health, rather than, you know, maybe in our parents' generation where it was kind of, you know, therapy was seen for those with like very serious problems. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And a
it's
lot
like
of
you had
emotions.
to have depression, you had to have something.
There had to be
right?
something very seriously wrong with you to be attending therapy.
Right.
Whereas like this
now-
is something that's like considered fine tuning, like going to the gym even, right? You have your physical health, you have your mental health. So yeah, definitely, you know, the decrease of stigma too plays into that.
Yeah, and you know now we definitely do preach that like you don't need to be in crisis to you know go find a therapist. Sometimes it is a matter of just proactively and preventatively taking care of your mental health, so that you know when life inevitably does happen in some case, that you have the skills, you have the awareness, you have the insight, and the tools necessary to be able to ride the wave. You know what I mean? So I think a lot of people are taking that very seriously now, which is amazing.
Yeah. And what is a crisis even, right? Like who's to say what's a crisis to one person versus another?
Exactly.
To your point, like it doesn't have to be your entire world shattering. Something small can make someone feel like their entire world is shattering. So like why not seek that third party to kind of talk that through with?
Yeah, 100%.
Exactly. And it's always nice to have like an unbiased opinion too, right? Rather than going to, you know, a friend or whatever who has that emotional connection to you. It's like, I don't really know this person, so I'm going to just kind of say whatever. You know?
They won't judge me.
Yeah, maybe they are internally, but no, I'm just kidding.
No, it's true. It's really like we talk about it all the time. We're so privileged to have the job that we have. It's very fulfilling work. It's hard work, but it's very fulfilling, you know, rewarding. You know, to be able to make a difference even in one person's life, right, is kind of a really great feeling. So
Absolutely.
You know, the lows can be low, but the highs are
highs
really, really,
are
really
high.
incredible. It's very special. And just noticing every now and again, you'll get like a little glimmer of feedback from a client, or, you know, somebody shares how much this whole process has changed their life in some capacity. And honestly, there's no better feeling.
I was going to say, it just probably just fuels you so much inside, knowing that like you were part of that reason, a big part of that reason.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm really curious to know, like, what do you guys cover? Like, what types of mental health disorders do you guys cover in your practice?
Yeah. So each of our therapists at our practice have their own specialties, right? They have their own specializations, what they like to work with. So that's a broad range. For me personally, over the years of my practice, I've preferred working with couples. So I do couples therapy. I also see individuals. I'll see, you know, kind of individuals for depression, anxiety, trauma, things like that. But I also specialize in seeing people with borderline personality disorder. So a lot of like emotion dysregulation, nervous system dysregulation, suicidal ideation, self-harm, things like that. Okay. So that's kind of like my little niche, if you will. Yeah.
Okay, amazing.
Yeah.
What about you, Tesia?
So I specialize in burnout, more specifically, and then I do a lot of work with what I like to call like the spectrum of trauma. So everything from like traumatic stress all the way to complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay. So those are kind of the presenting concerns that I would do. I see individuals only. I am not a couples counselor. I don't think I'd be a very good couples counselor, but yeah, definitely a little biased. But I no, so I do burnout, trauma, and then the general anxiety, depression, things like that. I do work a lot with ADHD as well, so I really enjoy working with that population. It's a lot of fun, and yeah, I think that's pretty much it. More recently, I've been kind of doing a lot more like teaching and training psychotherapists as well, so I'm kind of pivoting into taking more of a supervisory role, which I absolutely love because I do have a background in teaching, so I really enjoy, talking to like young therapists and those who like recently...
coaching them, mentoring them.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
Exactly.
I
So that's been
that.
a little bit of a career pivot in the past year, and it's been incredible. I absolutely love the supervising part.
That's amazing.
Oh, amazing.
I love that. So, okay, so I want to like dive in a little bit into ADHD specifically, because I've actually read recently that ADHD is like it's like on the rise for women specifically. Is that true?
Yes and no.
I was going to say on the rise, maybe not so much. Having people women specifically, become more aware of symptoms. Yes. Like Tesia can talk about it more because she specializes in it, but women tend to really like diminish or hide symptoms, even just, by default. We look at like societal conditioning, right? Girls historically, maybe even now, we're kind of meant to be like quieter and like prim and proper, so I think they do a good job of like masking symptoms. That makes it more difficult for women to become diagnosed than men, but I'll kind of let you speak to that a little bit more.
That's a really, really good point about ADHD. It wasn't necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily say it's on the rise. More people are becoming aware of the fact that this is actually a pretty common disorder.
Yeah.
And so what we've noticed with ADHD is that for a really long time, it was kind of, the diagnosis was reserved for like little white boys, right? Little hyperactive boys. And if you weren't, among that population, then you wouldn't necessarily, even like folks wouldn't think twice about offering a diagnosis or even considering that this might be a thing.
Right.
So I think with a lot more research, especially with regards to like the development of the brain, and how, parenting and genetics and all these sort of factors can come into play to make it so that, we have this larger body of research, this larger pool of awareness. And so now, a lot of women are like, hey, wow.
Yeah. Is this
This
what
is
I
a
have?
thing. Is this what I have? This
Like
sounds familiar.
this,
Well, I feel like and I feel like, I don't know if you were the same, but like every woman I talk to, I swear, is like, oh my God, I have ADHD. Like I have ADHD. Like everyone's just like almost like self-diagnosing. Like even I'll do it. I'm like, I literally have ADHD. Like a squirrel, gone. Right. So I'm just like, what is the actual criteria that you have to meet to have ADHD? When should somebody look in the mirror and be like, okay, these are my symptoms, like maybe I should, look into this a little bit more with a professional?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting thing that's going on right now, because I think our culture really speaks to this, like,
I was just gonna say our like
dopamine.
attention span is like fully decreased too. So it's like,
Sure.
is it ADHD or is it just that I'm used to 7-second videos and I can't
literally,
focus on anything else,
notifications coming left, right, and center. Everything's interrupted. Everything's urgent, and there's so much on our plate. So it's really hard to kind of time manage
Very
and prioritize.
overstimulated.
So ADHD at its core is a concern with regards to self-regulation. So there's a lot of different parts of our executive functioning, which is kind of the more prefrontal cortex, working part of our brain, the human part of our brain, as I like to call it. And so, what we notice with ADHD versus, just what are people calling it, like being chronically online?
Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Literally, yeah.
Yeah. So the biggest
Chronically
difference
online.
is noticing like how you might have a hard time self-regulating in all aspects of life, and that your symptoms are pervasive over time.
Like we're not talking about like little things here and there, right? It's consistent.
Yeah.
It's pervasive.
Yeah.
Right.
So if you have a really bad night's sleep, or like, you're going through a little bout of like, acute insomnia, then you're going to have a lot of very similar symptoms to ADHD. Like it's going to be harder to regulate your emotions. It's going to be harder to manage your time. It's going to be harder. Yeah, you're overwhelmed. You're sensitive.
Yeah.
Like, so there's kind of a lot going on.
There's a lot of like factors that come into play.
Yeah.
I think also, not unlike a lot of areas in health, like mental and, other areas of health, when it comes to women, they're so under-researched, right?
100%.
Yeah. So it's like how to then educate women on like, hey, if you're feeling this way, or if this, this isn't normal. I know society tells you need to be functioning no matter what you're feeling.
No, totally.
But no, actually you can benefit from some help.
Yeah, so there's two different sort of branches of ADHD. I don't know if you guys remember in the 90s, there was like ADD and ADHD. They've kind of conglomerated that under one category now in the DSM. So what we would look at for ADHD is they have like the hyperactive branch and then the inattentive branch. So the hyperactive branch kind of speaks a little bit more to that element of self-regulation. Like you might notice like some really highs and lows in terms of your energy, but it's also quite like the time window for that is quite short, meaning like that can happen multiple times throughout the day where you have a kind of hard time settling. You might get really hyperactive, and that can also present as like hyperactivity in the mind as well. So if your thoughts are just consistently racing, like even like a good like like a nice warm shower or like a nice like hike in nature, all those kinds of things that would typically settle our mind and our body. If you're not settling after that, then, you know, it's quite possible that might be the case for you. Again, it kind of has to be pervasive in all areas of life, not just like, I'm just spiraling about work, but then when I come home to my, you know, to my partner, I'm totally fine. You know what I mean? So we'd have to notice a lot of these symptoms that are kind of, you know, seeping into every element of life and having some kind of hindering your function basically. And then for the inattentive branch, this is like a lot of like forgetfulness. You might have a hard time kind of maybe even notice, it's called proprioception. So noticing where your body is in space. So you're kind of like bumping into things here and there and like, you know, forgetting where you like left your keys, where you left this, where you left that. And like time management can be a really big issue too, because you don't really like have a sense of time. So, you know, some people who are like constantly late in spite of all of their best efforts. Right. So again, if these symptoms are starting, we're all laughing. We're like, this is so real.
Like, wait a second.
I'm late often, but I'm Greek, so I run on Greek time. But then also,
that's so real.
Is it like my best efforts? I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's it.
You're like, wait,
because my husband
maybe
is Greek and he has that too. He's got the Greek time and the best efforts. Yeah. When he turns it on,
that's
he can be
what
very.
lacks, you know,
yeah, exactly.
The best effort to be on time.
Yeah. So accessing a diagnosis, there's a couple of ways to do it. One is speak to your family doctor, and then they would refer you to a psychiatrist. Of course, I know the wait list in Ontario specifically is absurd.
Incredibly
yeah,
long.
It's bananas.
And it's expensive.
It
right?
is.
It's expensive to seek out a diagnosis, though some things are becoming more affordable.
Yeah. So what we're noticing now is that there's a lot of nurse practitioners who have kind of popped up in kind of private healthcare and things like that. So they're able to run the assessment, to, you know, give folks access to medication. Medication is super, super, super helpful for ADHD. Of course, you know, I always like to say like skills and pills. So obviously it's not one without the other. You kind of do.
They go hand in hand.
They really do.
It's also
they totally
personal
do.
too, right? Like some people with ADHD will choose not to use a medication and, you know, teach their own.
Yeah, it's personal preference.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So if somebody can't get a diagnosis through a psychiatrist, like let's say it's, you know, money reasons or waitlist reasons, if they still suspect that they might have it, can they still come to see someone like yourself?
Yeah,
totally.
Absolutely. You can't prescribe medication. Is that
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
You don't need a formal diagnosis to explore some of these coping strategies. Simply put, the things we talk about in therapy for people who are struggling with ADHD are things we probably talk about like across the board-ish with some other clients. Of course, there's some tailored like coping strategies for people with ADHD, but it's not like the skills that we're teaching clients isn't like a do or die whether you have ADHD or whether you don't, right? Either it helps you or it doesn't. So, and there's actually some family doctors who will choose to prescribe medication even when a client does not have a formal diagnosis. So, but again, it's to like each their own. So we're in an interesting like middle ground area when it comes to ADHD.
Do you believe doctors should be doing that? 10, 20 years ago, it was all these little boys that the doctor would just decide like, oh yeah, your son has ADHD or ADD, like here you go.
It's so fascinating.
I can't speak to it. Like, you know, a doctor's practice is very different from, you know, a therapist's practice. And what they choose to do and what their college recommends is probably the guidelines that they choose to follow. There are like self-assessment tests that people can take literally online. Like with my clients, I use what is called an adult ADHD self-report scale. So ASRS for short.
You can Google it.
You can literally Google it. You can self-administer this. And every question that's asked on it mirrors the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual criteria. So if you like score significantly on this self-completed measure, it basically like, I mean, they can't say like you have ADHD from this measure, but they can say like the symptoms you have are highly consistent with that of somebody who's been diagnosed with ADHD, right? So even that alone, you know, there's things that people can do, you know, that I think doctors are also taking pretty seriously, right? Where they're saying like, oh, okay, well, if you meet all the criteria on the ASRS, then like you probably have ADHD. I've talked about this with my clients as well. One of the best ways you'll know if you have ADHD is whether medication works or doesn't.
Yes, exactly.
There you go.
That's so interesting. I
there
never
you
even
go.
thought of that.
Yep.
Yeah. So like if the medication is working, it's helping. It's like, okay, you
have ADHD.
Or have it. And then if you're
if it
still
does nothing, then it doesn't.
So for the most part with ADHD medication, like if you, there's like the branch of stimulants versus non-stimulants. And so, you know, if you were to take the medication and you don't have ADHD and it's a stimulant, you're just going to be bouncing off the walls. You know what I mean?
I was
You're
gonna
going to
say,
be
yeah, like,
flying
what would be
around
the-
and like
Gotcha.
you
Exactly.
actually might experience a lot of the symptoms of ADHD. Right? Funny
Yeah,
enough, right?
yeah.
But if you take the stimulants, it kind of has the opposite effect
Correct.
because of the ways in which dopamine is produced and all the dopamine receptors in our brain and whatnot. So, you know, if you take it and you have ADHD, it just calms you right down. Like you just get super duper centered. Your thoughts become very aligned.
Yeah,
like
You can
it's
focus and concentrate,
Exactly, yeah.
start and actually complete tasks,
Yeah.
things like that.
Right.
yeah, it's a game changer.
Interesting. Where it would do the opposite
Yes.
if you weren't. Okay,
Yeah.
so interesting.
So I always tell clients, I'm like, if your family doctor's, you know, willing to rock and roll and
Yeah,
like
and if you wanna
prescribe
give
you a
it a try.
medication,
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
gonna find out real quick whether you have ADHD
Yes.
or whether you
That's
don't.
a good way
Yeah.
to know, though. Like,
100%.
right?
But again,
Yeah.
the short answer to your question is like, what family doctors choose to do in their own practice, you know, we have to trust that that's in accordance with their college, and that's happening in like an ethical way. So yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, totally.
Definitely. Okay, well, yeah, I want to pivot a little bit. Obviously, like therapy, you know, as we've been talking about, like even just like getting a psychiatrist, like it's really expensive, right? And like therapy in itself is also can be expensive. Like not everyone has, you know, benefits or coverage or whatever the case may be, right? So what are some things that our listeners can do at home to improve their mental health, just from a general perspective? Because I think at the end of the day, like we all suffer with mental health to some degree, right?
Sure.
Like just because you don't have a specific diagnosis doesn't mean that you don't have stuff going on. Like,
Well, you have
know?
mental health and you have physical health. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like your mental health is just, it's part of you. And there
Yeah.
are certainly many things that you can do at home that are accessible, that are free, and pretty easy when you kind of have a really good understanding of how it works, you know?
yeah,
Yeah.
can you
I
break
mean,
that down?
Totally. I think, you know, I'll talk about a couple things, but when we look at sort of the detriment to the availability of social media, I think there's also some good things about that as well. People laugh about, you know, kind of what we call TikTok university, but there's therapists and doctors and people who are educating people on social media platforms. I'll put a little asterisk there that we can't, you know, listen to every piece of information that we
take
see
it with a grain of
online,
salt.
right?
Yeah.
But
It's
there
like
are
Wikipedia. You
actual
just
like
kinda start there. And
Exactly.
then, yeah.
There's actual licensed professionals who are able, just at the tip of your fingers, to teach someone how to regulate your nervous system, right? EFT tapping, somatic based skills, deep breathing, right? All these nervous system regulation skills that you can do at home and learn just from social media.
I've
right?
heard of the tapping before. Like, what is that? Like, can you explain how to do that?
So there's different ways that you can engage in this skill. The whole point behind it is that you're working to regulate your nervous system through different forms of tapping or touch, right? So, I mean, Tesia knows a lot more about like the nervous system and how things work kind of internally. You can speak to it if you want to, but there's like different ways that you can use the skill somatically to help you regulate your nervous system. So some people will like engage in like, I don't know if you've seen it, like you can like massage the earlobe and like stroke down to the collarbone, and then you're putting pressure on the collarbone. You can do like kind of like butterfly taps near the collarbone. Like all of these things are different examples of how you're stimulating your parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for rest and digest.
Right.
And that's what helps you regulate your nervous system, right? It's what helps bring your sympathetic nervous system back to a regulated state. So yeah, to that point, right? There's so much information that's at your fingertips that you don't necessarily have to access therapy for to have access to this information, which is great. So I think that's, again, we take it with a grain of salt who we're getting this information from.
Of course.
But I think that's really fantastic that there's so many resources that are so widely available now to the average person that you don't necessarily have to pay to go to therapy to learn some of these things about yourself, right? Like attachment theory is like a huge thing now. What's your attachment style, right? Everybody's talking about it.
It's like
right?
the new
But-
horoscope.
Exactly. Add that into your horoscope, right? But it's a huge hot topic that you can learn about on your own. Somatic based skills, nervous system regulation. You can even do things as simple as like taking care of your physical health, which is important for your mental health.
Absolutely.
You can journal. You can journal about intrusive thoughts or like cognitive distortions or unhelpful thinking styles and try to challenge them. Like, there's a lot of things you can do outside of being in a therapy space, I think.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, like, you know, all of these tools and strategies, you know, we talk about regulating our nervous system, and basically that's just getting your body into a state where you're feeling very calm and connected and grounded. In other words, you're actually able to access all of the parts of your brain, meaning you're able to, you know, think about your thoughts. You're able to, you know, leverage your attention and your awareness to pay attention to something specifically without necessarily panicking about it. Right? So when you start to get into the state of dysregulation or nervous system activation, that's when you start to get very anxious, maybe a little bit flighty, like the sympathetic distracted. And then, you know, opposite to that is the collapse response, where we kind of get into the burnout territory, where, you know, it kind of feels like this, like, really, really, really heavy, really sluggish feeling, like you just can't get out of bed, motivation isn't quite there,
like you're tired,
exhausted, and like tired in your bones. And it's not like a tiredness that you can just correct by, you know, having a really good night's sleep or whatever, you know. So
I think that's what's on the rise, like the burnout, and people just think I'm tired, and they'll sleep and they're still tired, and okay, is it my adrenals, is it this, is it that? I just think, like, there's so much noise, but then true. You know, you hit that point of burnout, and then what? Like, how do you backpedal from that?
Yeah. So I like to call burnout as the thing that just sneaks up on you, because I think a lot of us tend to ignore symptoms. At least I know I did historically. You know, there was a period of time where I actually burnt myself out because I was ignoring a lot of symptoms. Like, I'd be like, oh, I'm so tired, but push through it. Or like, I can't focus, or I'm not motivated, or I'm irritable all the time, but push through it, right?
You gotta get that one thing done.
Yeah, like you have to.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's like the thing that just like creeps right up, and then the next thing you know, you're not functioning anymore. But yeah, so there's things that we examine to try to prevent burnout, especially if we're noticing like the sudden sort of slight onset of symptoms, right? But a lot of that, you know, prevention of burnout or coping with burnout pertains to self-awareness, right? Like we can't catch what we don't know what to catch.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So what are certain things we can look out for in ourselves, but even amongst our loved ones? Like how can you tell when maybe someone's struggling and they don't know that they're struggling?
There's a couple of major symptoms that we would look at with burnout. So one of them being cynicism. So just kind of like a really negative, very like doom and gloom attitude on life, feeling really kind of, you know, disconnected and maybe even like more judgmental than you normally might be. So as Alyssa said earlier, like this like irritability. And so it kind of shows up in your mind.
Even, like stuck.
So that's the, you know, number two, of course, like the hopelessness, feeling like really like kind of disconnected, and, you know, not necessarily seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. Another one for burnout, we look at a lot of like a higher level of like self-critical thoughts. So, you know, we might notice that we're all of a sudden, you know, speaking to ourselves in ways that we normally might not, right? Like I'm not good at this anymore. I can't believe I'm doing this. Like, you know, just the inner critic just shows up and then just totally like berates you. You know what I mean? So there's a couple of things you can notice, especially with regards to burnout. Like, you know, it's just that negative attitude towards a lot of things, lack of motivation, debilitating exhaustion, hopelessness, all those kinds of things.
There's this like mental and emotional fatigue that just doesn't go away, right? Kind of like what you'd said earlier, you could sleep as much as you want and like
it's almost like I shouldn't be tired. I'm sleeping, I'm doing all the things, but you still feel drained mentally, physically.
Exactly.
All the things.
So those are some of the things you'd want to look out for, that, you know, if they're starting to creep up. I know for myself, some of the telltale signs for me is actually an increase in anxiety and irritability. As soon as I notice that I'm like more anxious than usual, more consistently anxious, like irritated about things that I know
things
that,
are getting
like,
on your nerves.
Like that I shouldn't really be irritated about. And like fatigue, that's like usually a pretty good telltale sign for me that I'm like, okay, I got to make some changes. So,
and what are those changes that you would implement at that point?
So
like
at that point,
to that level?
I'm increasing and prioritizing rest and self-care, including sleep. I'm setting boundaries with myself and with other people. Maybe I'll even reevaluate my priorities. A lot of us are super busy, and it's like, well, where am I gonna
Yeah.
where am I gonna cut the stuff,
That's
right?
what's hard. Yeah.
So maybe reevaluating my priorities and what feels to be like of utmost priority. I know we could also say, well, everything's important. Well, like what's of utmost priority, and then maybe we're starting to set some boundaries and set some limitations.
So what we're noticing with burnout is that one of the major root causes that isn't necessarily always seen is that we're living a life that is out of alignment with our core values. So you're kind of, running on this hamster wheel or running on this treadmill that's going absolutely nowhere, but you're so disconnected from the things that actually bring you a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, a sense of joy in life, right? So, there's a lot of, major causes of burnout, specifically like lack of resources in your line of work, or at home, even if you have a lot going on at home, when your actions don't necessarily yield the outcomes that you want, so that can be very frustrating for a lot of folks. And like burnout essentially is just you get all the stress pent up over time, and then that chronic stress leads to that collapse response that I talked about earlier. And so as Alyssa had said earlier, like, one of the major things that we do recognize with burnout is that we're not necessarily prioritizing, our values.
What matters.
Right. And so as Alyssa said, you tend to get really anxious, and that's how for you.
Yeah.
But for me, I notice I get a lot more avoidant. So my to-do list builds, and I just kind of like don't look at certain things.
Almost.
I
Almost
procrastinate.
can't face what's on there. You
No,
don't wanna-
totally. And that's how I know I'm like, oh, okay, something's got to change here. This is a really good sign for me. So it can be quite personal, but typically you might notice like you're more dysregulated, or you're avoiding a lot of things, and you're just kind of like walking around with this like heaviness and whatnot.
And to your point, like maybe even a real lack of fulfillment as well. Like
Totally.
when people feel like they're running the rat race, right? Like we're no longer connected to what fulfills us and brings us purpose, that can also drive down, that possibility of burnout. So to that point, I think like living in alignment with your values is another great way of like preventing or mitigating early onset symptoms of burnout.
And burnout, again, it's like it happens. You know what I mean? It happens to the best of us.
100%.
I've totally burnt myself out before. I
was gonna say,
probably
like,
will
you
do it
girls are
again.
entrepreneurs, and you're, you have a very difficult job.
And we've burnt out.
And we totally have.
We are
And
the
I'll
face
probably
of
do it
burnout.
again.
No, literally saying, like, you're preaching to the choir, right?
Yeah. So I mean, as much as like, we can work very hard at preventing it. And I think prevention is definitely key. But, if you do end up in that state of burnout, like
There's things
recovery
you
is
can do.
possible.
Yeah, there's
absolutely.
things you can do.
Yeah.
It
Call
takes
us.
a bit longer, but there's things that you can do.
I think it's just like prioritizing yourself. Not everyone is living their, fulfillment day to day, right? Like
No.
sometimes we get stuck in autopilot, but then how do you then like make it a practice and a habit to check back in with yourself so that, you're not saying yes to everything, to your point, right? Like setting those boundaries.
And one thing we do notice too is that a lot of people, you kind of stumble into this career in your like early to mid 20s, and then, maybe 5 years down the line, you're like, okay, you know what? I actually really don't like this, but it pays well and it has good benefits and blah, blah, blah. So like, a lot of burnout prevention in those cases doesn't necessarily mean like up and quitting your job, because that's also not always
Sometimes
very
not an
realistic.
option.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? Like you
Yeah.
might have a family, you might have other things in life that are going on. So sometimes it is in recognizing how we can kind of align ourselves with our values outside of work, and recognize work is just being work. Right. And with that sometimes includes, some work around some like internal psychological boundaries that we can set with like, doing our best not to, again, say yes to everything, doing our best not to take things personally, and just kind of allowing work to be work, so that you can focus a little bit more on that values building outside of work, right? Like
for
work
sure.
doesn't necessarily need to be your passion project, you know?
No,
Or
it
your
could just
identity.
be fueling
No,
up
totally,
your bank account,
yeah.
because at the end
Literally.
of the day, we all
100%.
have to live.
We all have bills. Like
We
we
do.
all have
We do.
things. We
Yeah.
got bills.
Yeah.
And not everybody is, in that position where they're like, as lucky, where like they found something that they're super passionate about that pays them well, right? And
I'd say it's actually kind of rare in a lot of
very
cases.
rare. I
Yeah.
agree 100%. And you're kind of just like what you kind of said earlier, like rolling through the motions, like just on autopilot kind of thing, right? Because you're like, well, I got to do this.
Gotta do
You're not
it.
happy about it, but it's about, I think what you're trying to really say is that it's like about like finding stuff outside of that to connect to yourself
Totally.
and bring you joy, so that you have something else like lighting you up almost.
That. And I think it's important to understand what are the contributing factors to what's leading to burnout, right? Kind
Totally.
of like what Tesia said. If your job is like soul sucking, but you know that like you don't really have the option to go anywhere or do anything at that point in time, right? Like there's a lot that you can look into. We look at expectations of the self, fears, right? Maybe there's like a fear of judgment by other people, like overexertion. Like there's so many things that can contribute to burnout that we have to examine.
Right.
Yeah.
It's
Even
like peeling back the layers of the onion.
Yeah.
A little bit. Yeah.
For sure. It's not just like one solid
No, it's
thing.
never just
There's
one
a lot
thing.
of
It never
depth to
is.
it.
Yeah.
It never is.
Yeah.
Like, we have all of these different dimensions of our life. You know what I mean? Like we have our relationships, our friendships, we have our family, we have our career, we have our self-care, which can be a major dimension and also one that's lacking for a lot of people.
Definitely.
And just when we look at something as simple as sleep, for example, like I would argue that sleep is probably one of the most important things that you can do for your mental health. What you're eating, what your relationship with food is like. Are you moving your body? What's your relationship with exercise like? So, when we kind of map all of these things out in therapy, and this is where therapy can be very valuable because we're not just going to be super fixated on one thing. We're going to be like, okay, so, you're talking a lot about X, Y, and Z, but, do you have people in your life that you can, reach out to and talk to? And, are you part of a community? Are you sleeping?
Yeah. Like it's as simple as that sometimes.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like it's not always like a very linear thing. Life is extremely multifaceted in so many dimensions, and it's always important to kind of notice the ways in which all of these dimensions are kind of playing into one another, and how we might actually be maybe disconnected from some of those dimensions too.
From my own experience, like I have experienced a bad relationship with food. I've had, eating disorders in the past, like all the things. And for me, it's something that never like fully goes away. Like it's not just like, oh yeah, I recovered, I'm good, never thought about it again, I'm a new woman. Like that's just, to me, that's not how it works. It's always kind of that like dark cloud that kind of stays with you as you move through life. And so I guess I just want to kind of touch on, just that connection, that emotional connection that people have to food, and how we can create a better, relationship with food, and just all of those things.
And I just want to start by saying, thank you for sharing that. And I know it's a really vulnerable thing to, talk about. And fun fact, I had a pretty nasty eating disorder myself, and that's actually what led me to want to become a therapist.
Oh, wow.
Funny enough.
Oh,
yeah. It was, I'm like 18, 19 years old, just like lots going on. And I, landed in therapy myself, and I was like, oh, I kind of like this. Like, this is kind of fun.
That's
like,
amazing.
Yeah. This is a vibe. I was going through like teachers college at the time. And then, one thing led to another. And then I was, pursuing that as a career myself. And so I totally understand that. And I think, as women, we can definitely really attest to having a really interesting relationship with food, whether it transcends all the way into an eating disorder or whether it's just a disordered eating patterns. Culture, society, all these things play a large role in that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
I think I'll kind of take my own twist on when we look at, the connection between emotions and food. I think we oftentimes look at, disordered eating or like emotional eating as sometimes being associated with like, well, I eat when I'm bored, or I eat when I'm stressed, or I eat when I'm distracted, or what have you. But even from my own personal experience, I eat a lot when I'm happy. I come from an Italian family, but it kind of like transcended into like overeating for me, because I would eat around family, a lot of food. We're Italian, we're cooking a lot.
You're
like
social,
friggin' piling on your plate. Like I would eat, a lot at celebrations, holidays. Like my relationship with food became a little bit problematic, but from the great things that happened in my life, right? That we don't actually like think about too much, right?
That's so true. That's a good point.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of our food centers around celebration.
Joy
when you
and
really think about
celebration,
it, right?
right?
And
being
you can't
social.
remove the emotion from food.
Totally.
Yeah.
So it's not so much that we have an emotional connection to food. It's just what we do with the emotions that we're feeling when we recognize that we're acting on that urge of that emotion to eat, to emotionally eat in this case. So when I work with clients, I usually will give them a little bit of homework, and I'll say, you know what, the next time there's that urge to just eat suddenly, ask yourself, am I physically hungry or am I emotionally hungry right now? Like if we know that there is a cue of physical hunger, we all know what that is. Do we all wait for the physical cue of hunger to eat? I don't think so, right?
No,
At least in
not
my
always.
case,
Yeah.
when I'm visiting family, like the emotional hunger is like, it's there. Physical hunger isn't so much a factor. So even just stopping and like being very mindful and turning inwards and saying like, okay, am I actually physically hungry right now? Or am I emotionally hungry? And if it is, I'm emotionally hungry, we can say, okay, what emotion am I feeling? And if it's, you know, sadness, then we find other adaptive coping tools for sadness, right? Or if it's boredom, right? We're filling our time differently, more meaningfully.
Getting a bit of a dopamine kick, you know?
Like mindfulness around eating is kind of huge. We don't really look at what you're eating. It's more so your relationship
What's
with
prompting
food.
you to turn to food?
Correct.
100%.
Exactly. So mindful eating is really, really huge. It's a thing that we talk about a lot in therapy when it comes to eating and our relationship with food. So
I have a question just on the note of like eating or turning to food and people's relationship with food.
Yeah.
Because Christina and I have talked about this a lot. All these trends of like tracking your food and weighing your food. And I mean, I understand some people do it to track macros. Like I myself have done that multiple times throughout like my fitness journey or whatnot. But some people, I have a very close friend of mine that's like, well, tracking my food triggers like old
Totally.
bad
Absolutely.
relationships that
That's
I've had
what it
with
did for
food.
me.
Like,
Oh,
should
yeah.
I be tracking this? You know, and then so there's two sides to that, right? You're like, okay, well, I want to track to make sure I'm getting enough protein, let's say, but then it's also
Or you have aesthetic goals, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
that's a thing.
but then
absolutely.
it risks like you become perhaps obsessive. Like I've even gotten like, oh my god, I didn't weigh this, so it's bad. Like
So with intuitive eating, you know, all of it really boils down to how you feel. Do you have the energy to do what you want to do, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, if you're an athlete, for example, and maybe you do need to track your protein, you need to track your carbs because you have a specific athletic goal, or as you said, you know, some fitness models.
which could be healthy. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. It totally could.
Like
but
it's
it
okay
really-
to have a goal
Of
kind of
course,
thing, right?
totally.
Yeah.
But it all boils down to how you feel ultimately, right?
Yeah.
And I always like to say, like, there's no good or bad food, and the minute we ascribe any kind of morality to food is usually when we really get lost in the sauce. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, like, you know, sometimes I feel amazing if I eat a double Big Mac, right? Like, and that's just
like,
maybe
that's
what
what
I
I
needed that
needed.
day.
Yeah,
Maybe we needed the Big Mac that
And then
day.
sometimes I feel really good when I eat a kale chicken Caesar salad, right?
Yeah.
So I think, you know, when we really notice, like, you know, what is my intention around eating this, as Alyssa said, like that mindful eating practice, but then also looking at the outcome of that, right? If I'm, you know, heavily restricting my diet and like maybe I'm like, you know, trying to either like lose weight or, you know, everyone's like, I gotta lose 5 pounds, whatever, or beach season is coming up and all that kind of stuff, you know, when it really boils down to it, you might notice that you are exhausted, right? Or you're more anxious because our body does enter into a fight or flight state when we are heavily restricting, which is interesting, you know? And so what's the outcome and how do you necessarily feel
How are you
around
feeling?
the habits, right? Because again, there's no good or bad food. There's certainly food that's probably a little bit more nutritious than others, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's better. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
maybe it's more like how you're feeling if you're tracking your food, if you're tracking your macros, if you're noticing that you're like hyper fixating and then, you know, there's self punishment if we didn't like totally meet that, like that could border maladaptive and unhealthy, right? So I think it just is about being mindful about what it's becoming for you, right? For some people, they can track, you know, protein and they have a very healthy relationship with what's happening there. Or they catch certain things and they just, you know, use good coping tools. If they're noticing like self-criticism because they didn't meet their protein goal that day, they're like, that's okay. I almost met it. That's awesome, right? Like that counts.
They can
right?
brush
So-
it off.
Yeah.
So
So
it's more
just
like
all-
it's a problem when
Yeah, when there's rigidity around it, right?
Making peace with food is it's such a hard and complicated practice.
It is.
But it is something that is so rewarding, right? So, you know, if any of our listeners here are thinking about like, oh my gosh, this is totally me, I can really see myself in some of this, like really evaluate, you know, what your relationship is with food.
Right.
You know, this is, again, where therapy can come in really helpful with regards to some practices around mindful eating, intuitive eating, figuring out what your goals are, and then figuring out ultimately how to make peace with all of those things too, right? Like how to reduce some of the food noise that's kind of going on and the obsessiveness and whatnot. And so, yeah. And it's
Food
honestly,
noise,
it's an
yeah.
ongoing practice. And, you know, the interesting thing about eating disorders is that from an addictions perspective, it's the only addiction we can't cut off cold turkey,
Yeah.
right? So it all,
That is so true.
yeah, it
And I think
is
that's
like,
why it always follows you
Yep,
no matter
100%.
what,
It
right?
does.
Like I
And it
find,
will.
right? It always will. Like I'll find, you know, I'm like, oh, I've been, you know, so good for, you know, the last 2 years or whatever it is. And it's like, I go to one event or something triggers me and then, whatever it is, right? And then it's like, oh my God, I'm right back at square one again.
But you know what? It's not that you're triggered, right? It's just what you do with that trigger.
Yeah.
It's not the trigger will be there, right? Like when we're also looking to heal from trauma, like we're never like just forgetting about it or move, like, the same thing can be said, excuse me, with eating disorders, or, difficult relationship with food. The trigger will always be there. It's just what you do with that trigger that matters, right?
Thanks so much for joining us. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, we'd really appreciate if you could like, rate, and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts.
Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok at It's That Girl Club to stay in the loop with your girls and join us in becoming that girl. See you next Wednesday.